Welcome to our Natural Habitat Adventures presentation today. This is your daily dose of nature. And our topic today, families, friends, and lovers, the social life of cetaceans. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speakers today. They're coming to you from Montana. We are here today with two of our amazing guides, Lindsey and Rachel. Welcome to both of you. Hi, Lindsey. Hi, Rachel.
Hello. How's it going, everyone? Welcome. So the purpose of our talk today is just the different kinds of societies that whales and dolphins have. So we'll be focusing on how they relate to one another on an individual level.
All right, and so my name is Lindsey. I'm from Montana. I'm trained as an ecologist with an emphasis in animal behavior. And I've worked in the field around the world on a lot of different scientific projects with marine mammals. So specifically in New Zealand, I've worked with sperm whales, in Alaska with humpback whales, and also in Namibia with dolphins.
Hi, I'm Rachel, and I've worked as a guide in the polar regions as well for the last 8 years. I guide trips for natural habitat in Alaska, Churchill, Iceland, and East Greenland. I prefer the cold realms of our planet. I'm a marine ecologist, and I've been affiliated with a research organization called Mingan Island Cetacean Study, located in Quebec, Canada, for the last 9 years, where we study 5 different species of baleen whales that are recovering from historical exploitation and are now facing the new modern threats of our oceans.
Cool. So I think what drew both of us into the field of studying marine mammals in general was the fact that they're really social. And that's something that really was fascinating to me, is I found that in some ways I could relate to them. These are animals that some species have really intense social structures, or they have friends, they have family members, and that's a realm that we really want to dive into today and talk a little bit more about just kind of some of the different species that are out there and some of the social structures that exist. So we're just going to pull a couple of our favorites out. Each one could easily be its own webinar, but we're just going to give you a little taste of some of the really spectacular animals and their social structures that are out there.
Hopefully you've had a chance to see whales and dolphins before, and the species that we're talking about can be found all around the world on different destinations that Natural Habitat travels to. So hopefully you have seen them firsthand yourself. When we go out onto a boat, or even when we're viewing animals from land, and we see a group of animals together in the same place, it can be really tempting to think that they are socially connected together. But social structure is just one of the reasons why a group of animals might be in the same place at the same time. They could be drawn there for many different reasons.
Yeah, so when you're out on the water looking at a group of marine mammals, you're actually only seeing just a small portion of their lives. So if you've ever been out on the water with a group of whales or a group of dolphins, you're only seeing them at the surface for maybe 10% of their life. So it's really hard to get a sense of what's actually going on. And so kind of a fun analogy is to think of yourself as an alien looking at these different animals. And so if you can imagine an alien, for instance, looking down at a big movie theater, and you see a bunch of people together in this movie theater, but it's really hard to tell why they're all there or if they all know each other. So for instance, does the guy in the front row know the kid behind him that's picking his seat? Maybe, maybe not. But if you sit there long enough and you spend enough time looking at all those different individuals in that theater, you might say, oh, there's a couple people there that are whispering in the back, or, oh, look, there's someone sharing their popcorn. And so you can start to tease apart these little details and put together a bigger picture of the social relationships that are existing within this group.
Yeah, the same idea applies to whales and dolphins, and figuring out who, if they are connected together, and if so, who are they connected to? Are there some that they're connected to more closely than others, or whatnot? So social structure is just referring to how individuals in the community relate to one another, and there can be different levels of social structure, and there can be many different roles that an individual can play and find themselves in a community.
Yeah, so one of the big things that you first have to think about when you're looking at a cetacean, so again, those are whales and dolphins, is thinking about whether you're looking at a baleen whale or a toothed whale. So baleen whales, they vocalize at really low frequencies. That means that their calls can travel really, really far underwater. And toothed whales, on the other hand, they're using echolocation. They tend to vocalize at higher frequencies. So all of their sounds are like clicks and whistles. And so to kind of flash back to those baleen whales, one really good example of their sort of calls are humpback whale song. And that's something that you've probably heard at one point or another. Here's just a visualization of what that looks like on a screen. And these songs can last upwards of 30 minutes to 45 minutes, very long, complicated serenades.
And the vocalizations actually have such a pattern and structure that it does conform to what song is. And these songs are learned from different individuals. There's also improvisation, but it's passed on within a community between individuals. It's learned.
Yeah, so in general, kind of going off the song, that's probably the one aspect of humpback whale life that's been studied the most, so since the 1970s. But outside of that, if you look at any guidebook describing baleen whales, one of the first descriptions you're probably going to see is that they're so-called asocial, meaning that they don't tend to have long-lasting relationships. But our view on that is starting to change a little bit. I mean, remembering that, again, these animals are vocalizing at a really low frequency, meaning that maybe they are communicating with one another, but they're just really far apart. And we don't really have the technology yet to be able to capture those subtleties. But what we have been able to see is cooperation between individuals, especially with feeding. And this is a photograph here of bubble net feeding, and this is something that's really awesome to see. They do it all around the world, but probably most famously in Alaska. And there, the Alaska Whale Foundation has been studying this behavior for a long time at this point. And what they've found is that there's about 80 individuals within the whole population in Alaska, in the southeast part of Alaska, so near Juneau, that are doing this behavior. And at different points in time, different individuals within that group of 80 are coming together and they're using this method to feed. And essentially what they're doing is upwards of sometimes 20 animals are converging. They're diving beneath a group of prey. They're blowing bubbles in a circle around that prey so the prey groups together. They're mostly doing this around herring. And then one animal within that group is going to make a big booming call. And the rest of the animals are going to swarm together and erupt at the surface, capturing the prey that's been trapped between the bubbles and the surface of the water. And we have a video clip to show you.
So that was a video by my friend Richard Seide. Richard, thanks a lot for showing that. So that's a visual representation of that bubble net feeding behavior, which is this cooperative behavior that's illustrating the point that this kind of social structure is driven by a concentrated food resource.
Exactly. But again, the longer that we've spent, the more long-term studies that have been out there in the world, the more we discovered that this isn't the only kind of social relationship that humpback whales have.
So bubble net feeding is an example of fluid associations between individuals. So they're meeting up again year after year, and the same individuals might end up in the same bubble net feeding group. But as far as we know, it's pretty much a mix and match. They might end up with whoever. It's random. However, in my study area in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a colleague and good friend of mine, Dr. Christian Ramp, has found evidence for non-random associations between individuals. So it seems that some humpback whales have preferentially chosen other individuals that they like to hang out with repeatedly. And most of these associations last for just a single feeding season, just one summer here in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Quebec. This can be male and female pairs and also female-female pairs. However, by knowing these individuals and looking at them over their lives, so since the late 1970s here in the study area, we found that female associations are much stronger, and so much strong that through consecutive feeding seasons, the same individual females have been documented pairing up again and again. The average time for this to happen is about 3 years, so 3 consecutive summers the same females are meeting up again and spending the feeding season together. However, one of the most notable exceptions and most interesting case was between 2 of the oldest documented females in this feeding population in the North Atlantic. So on the top of the screen, you see 2 different tails or flukes of 2 female humpback whales. The one on the left is named Splish. The one on the right is named Trax. And these 2 females were documented as adults in the early 1980s. We don't know their exact age, but they're definitely one of the older members in the population, and they're close enough in age. So these 2 females were documented coming back year after year for 6 consecutive seasons. And so this pair and a couple others have given evidence that there's not only friends of humpback whales, but there might also be some best friends for whatever reason. And the questions that this has furthered in our minds are the really interesting points of this research. What broke that 6-year pattern was both of these individuals, Splish and Trax, each had a calf. And it seems like caring for your youngster might take away the preference to hang out with your best friend for whatever reason. So these are long-term relationships that were quite novel in terms of what we understand about baleen whale social structure and behavior. And so this raises a lot of questions about other species like blue whales or fin whales or sei whales that are really much more difficult to study compared to humpback whales and a lot of the toothed whales that spend a lot of time in the coastal regions of our planet, and therefore we have much greater access to, and they're easier to study. So the fact that we have learned more about the possibilities of social structure for these baleen whales indicates they might not fit into what we understand social structure to be like as it's framed in terms of toothed whales, which we definitely know a lot more about.
Yeah, so as Rachel was saying, we've done a lot more research on the toothed whales. And on your screen, you see a bottlenose dolphin. This is probably what pops into everyone's head when you think about a marine mammal. If you think of flipper, you think of a dolphin. And the bottlenose dolphins are fascinating. They actually have a really complicated social structure that is really analogous to ours. They have complex social relationships and they have really close friendships, but they also have animals that they're just temporarily associated with. They have family members as well. And so they have these large social networks, a part of whatever community that they happen to be living in. And one of the big things that researchers were asking when they first started looking at bottlenose dolphins and starting to realize that they have all these different complicated relationships is whether or not dolphins are self-aware. Because in order to know how you fit into these complex social worlds, you need to have some form of sense of self. But then, of course, how do you figure out whether an animal is self-aware, right? That's a big question. Well, turns out figuring it out was kind of simple. You put it in front of a mirror. And so, for example, if you put Fido the dog in front of a mirror, that dog is going to look at its reflection in the mirror, but it's going to see it as another dog. It's not going to behave any differently toward its reflection than it would toward another dog, or it might just ignore it. On the other hand, if you put a dolphin or a great ape or an elephant in front of the mirror, you're going to see their behavior change. You're going to see that click moment where suddenly they're realizing that they're looking at a reflection of themselves. You might see them make some funny faces or turn around and inspect a different part of your body. Researchers will do something where they put a mark on their body somewhere with a pen, and then the animal might go and use the mirror as a tool to kind of see what they did. And sort of similar to us maybe when we were teenagers, they seem to really like looking at themselves in the mirror, fixing their hair or whatever else they need to do. And it's really entertaining. And so we wanted to share this clip with you of a young dolphin that's inspecting himself in front of the mirror. I'm going to go ahead and play that one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is such a neat video, everybody. So I'm going to bring it up again, same process as before, and just making sure that everybody is in sync with me on this. This video does not have any sound, so it's 30 seconds, no sound, but it's plenty entertaining without that. So we hope you enjoy it, and we'll be back with you in about 30 seconds. Oh my gosh, I love that. It was so cute.
I know, isn't it cute? So yeah, it's really fun, and it's really cool to think about kind of getting in the head of another animal's mind and try to figure out what's going on there a little bit. And to go off of that a bit with the self-awareness, we've also discovered that dolphins have names for themselves, and we call these signature whistles. And so within the first few months of a young dolphin's life, they will develop a whistle that is distinctly their own. And so it's a name. And they use it a little bit differently than we do. So instead of me calling out for, oh, hey, Rachel, I would stand there and be saying, Lindsey, Lindsey, Lindsey. And then I'd sit around and listen for all the other signature whistles that dolphins are saying in the area so I could hone in on exactly who I was listening for. And these are really, really stable calls. So especially for females, they'll stay with their same signature whistle throughout their life. Once they've had their signature whistle, it's set. The exception to this is with young males that form a really tight bond with another one or two males. And we call these alliances. And so this is so cool because, again, you have these animals that have really big brains, are highly social, and what you can sometimes see is that young males, if they have mothers that are friends with other mothers in the area, they'll start hanging out. And these young calves will become like blood brothers. They'll do everything together. They'll chase fish together. They'll chase girls together. And in studies that have been done for a long time, like in Shark Bay, Australia, they've found that these male alliances are incredibly stable. There's some males that have not left each other's side in over 30 years. So that's an amazing social bond to have. But what's really interesting about this is that their signature whistles change. And so instead of being Fred, George, and Bob, they all become Bob. And so again, remembering that these are animals that have a sense of self, they have self-recognition, they have names. The fact that these animals suddenly all identify as being one being is incredibly interesting. And so just kind of thinking about how that animal perceives their world and is interacting with it, just a lot of really fun things to be considering when thinking about bottlenose dolphins and their relationships. And again, these animals are not related to one another. And so they're just very close friends, essentially. And so with the dolphins, you have, again, these fission-fusion societies where you have differences between friends and family members. Kind of the next level to this is looking at species that are centered around the family.
Yeah, so family ties, these are the most stable bonds that we tend to see. And species that live in very close-knit family groups include sperm whales, killer whales, and pilot whales. And these often are the species, again, that have had long-term research focused on them for the last 30 or 40 years or so. These family bonds are often part of matrilineal societies. So the oldest matriarch, she's the leader, she's in charge of that social group. She has the most knowledge, and the rest of the members of her group are generally her offspring. They're genetically related individuals making up this group. They're all tied together. So it's generally her daughters and her daughters' offspring. If a group starts getting too large, it's likely one of the older daughters that's going to break off and start to form her own social group, still associating with her mother's group, but less often. Males are generally staying by their mother's side for their entire lives. And as an extreme example, male killer whales are hardly ever leaving their mother's side for their entire life. And it's also been documented several times that adult male killer whales don't live a year or two beyond their mother disappearing and presumably dying. So very, very tight social bonds. This is definitely the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of tying a social structure together. And all members of these genetically related groups take part in raising the young and teaching the young. There's a lot that's passed on in terms of behavior, in terms of who to hang out with, where to go, what food to eat, and so on. Killer whales, again, one of these species that exhibits very tight social groups. One of the ways that they identify as this specific group is through vocalizations. And this is true of sperm whales and pilot whales as well. So these family groups often have very obvious and extreme markers about them that are unique to being them, so that they can know who each other are and to show that difference to other groups around. You know which group you belong to if you are very obvious about who you belong to. So this can take the form of specialized hunting habitats. It can take the form of the type of prey that these animals are specializing in hunting or prefer to go after. And it can also take the form of vocalizations, again, the sounds that make up the language of these animals. And a groundbreaking discovery is that a lot of these family units have their own dialect. Most famously portrayed with the killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, but also existing for sperm whales and pilot whales in other parts of the world as well. So the spectrogram you see on the top of the screen here is an example of the pulsed call types that one family group in Alaska and Prince William Sound makes. So you can think of this like a regional dialect and words or phrases that are also specific to that regional dialect. So these call types are made the most frequently by this family group. And if you're listening in on the oceans with an underwater microphone or hydrophone, you can acoustically identify which family group is in the area. So again, this is one example of the ways that these animals identify each other and identify their place in the greater community of other family groups and other species around them.
So we're going to play you a quick sound bite of a group of resident orcas in Alaska. Except I pressed it forward. So that's pretty fun to hear a little bit. So yeah, kind of to build off of what Rachel was saying is that, again, you're looking at these very complex families that are doing different things. And this is where we can really pull in conservation. And so knowing social structure can be really informative when you're talking about how to conserve an animal. And as guides and as researchers, as members of natural habitat, that's our end goal always, is conservation. How can we best help our planet? How can we best help our fellow species out there? And having an understanding of these societies can be incredibly informative to how we go about tackling a lot of the issues that we're facing today with the planet and in different parts of our oceans. And so, like Rachel was saying before, you have these different groups of orcas that are making distinctive calls depending on what family group they're associated with. They're also eating different things as well. And so when you're talking about the Pacific Northwest of the United States, south of Canada and Alaska, we have 3 different cultures of killer whales. And I don't know if you can see my mouse at all, but there are these ones here on the top right hand of the screen, the first 3 you see. And these are the residents, transients, and offshores. So the resident orcas, they're eating mostly fish. You have the transient orcas, they're feeding off of marine mammals. And you have the offshores, and they're going after sharks mostly, actually. And what's fascinating is these animals are using the same seas, the same waters, but they're doing completely different things. They have different vocalizations that are distinctive. They're going after different food types. They're using different areas during different times of the year. And so a blanket conservation plan for orcas in general really isn't going to work in a place like this where you have animals that are doing such different things behaviorally.
They're also not interbreeding. So we know, particularly obvious for the mammal-eating killer whales and the fish-eating killer whales, they have not interbred for the past 75,000 years, if not more. So the diversity of their culture is not going to be continued if one of them doesn't survive. And in a lot of cases, human activities are impacting these ecotypes in different ways. Some are more sensitive than others. So as Lindsey was saying, blanket conservation isn't going to work if your goal is to preserve the cultural diversity that we've discovered exists within these populations, which is just absolutely incredible. So because we discovered that they are culturally distinct, we discovered that one population has been declining for the last 30 years. And this definitely isn't new news, but it's definitely getting more attention, I would say, in the past year or two. And this population of these southern resident killer whales has obviously different conservation requirements than the other populations that are living in the same area doing okay. So this led to the 2005 listing of this population on the endangered species list of the United States, so that tailored measures could be applied to this one population and more of a case-by-case situation could arise from it. And a lot of good has come from that because we understand that they are so different from one another.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to how humans in general, our views toward conservation have changed and kind of evolved themselves into the fact that we're not just valuing species for diversity and for numbers, but we're also starting to value them for their behavior and for their cultures and seeing how individuals within this whole world are special as well. And so that's a really awesome thing, I think. And moving forward, it also just shows how important doing more research into behavior and into the social lives of different species is so important. And so hopefully more and more of that will continue because, I mean, we keep finding these really fascinating things the more and more we learn about them. So again, thank you all for tuning in. We just kind of want to end you on sort of a fun quote here. One of my favorites, of course, by a really scientific source from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But it says, "Man has always assumed that he was more intelligent than dolphins because he's achieved so much. The wheel, New York, wars, and so on, whilst all the dolphins had ever done was muck about in the water, having a good time. But conversely, the dolphins had always believed that they were far more intelligent than man, for precisely the same reason." So yeah, so thank you all again so very, very much. We can open it up to questions for sure now. How do I?
Yes, good. Thank you so much. We've got some terrific questions here, and just want to invite all of you listening, if you have questions for Lindsey and Rachel, now is the time to get those in. The question box is either on the right-hand side of your screen or down below if you're on a mobile device. So, Rachel and Lindsey, we have a question. Once again, if you can tell us a little bit about your education backgrounds that led to the love of cetaceans.
Well, that's kind of funny, actually, because we went to college together. And so we both attended College of the Atlantic in Maine, and we both got into marine mammal research there. They have a small research group associated with the university called Allied Whale. And from there, after kind of getting experience with marine mammal research, we continued to get jobs outside of that and eventually found guiding and natural habitat. So both of us have degrees in human ecology and general wildlife ecology as well.
Thank you. All right, I have an orca question for you. Can different pods of orcas talk to each other?
Great question. So yes, different ecotypes or different pods or communities of killer whales, they can definitely hear each other. So we know that the frequencies that they communicate at can be heard by other individuals. But the really fascinating thing, at least in terms of the two ecotypes that we were talking about, the mammal-eating killer whales and the fish-eating killer whales of the Pacific Northwest, is that behaviorally they seem to actively avoid each other. While they inhabit this same general habitat, they avoid each other quite obviously. And so if one pod of fish-eating killer whales is in a bay and a group of mammal-eating killer whales comes around the corner, at least what's been observed so far to date is that they turn around and head out of there almost immediately. So that is something that still needs to be looked into further in terms of what's going on. But they behaviorally disassociate with each other. But they are still making vocalizations on the same frequency that yes, they could hear each other. Whether their call types, we don't know exactly what information is being conveyed by those call types. So whether those vocalizations make sense to another group of killer whales is another question, and definitely interesting to think about.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Which whale species bubble feed?
So the humpback whale are the ones that bubble feed.
Okay. All right. And good. Thank you. We have our friends from Houston, Texas on again today, Lauren and Parker. Lauren's 10 and Parker is 9, and they were on another of our webinars earlier this week. And their dad has submitted a question for them. How deep can dolphins dive, and how long can they hold their breath?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So, do you want to field that?
Well, I'll give the deepest diving marine mammal. So the record holder for all cetaceans, whales and dolphins diving down is the Cuvier's beaked whale, which has been recorded diving down to almost 10,000 feet, 9,800 something feet. And they've recorded that with a suction cup tag that they attached to the animal temporarily, and they were just lucky enough that the animal that they had attached the tag to went down to 9,800 feet. So that's the deepest diving cetacean out there, a Cuvier's beaked whale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and using similar tagging techniques, they've attached tags to sperm whales, and I'm not sure if they're the longest to hold their breath, but they can hold their breath over 90 minutes, upwards of 2 hours, which is amazing. Because, yeah, they're mammals, right? So mammals have to be able to get oxygen and to be able to breathe. And so the fact that they're able to hold their breath like that long is just incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. We have a climate change question for you. We talked a lot about climate change in our bear daily dose yesterday. How does climate change affect their location and feeding areas for cetaceans?
Well, climate change it's affecting the whole ecology of the ocean, really. So if you have warmer water, that's going to change where prey is distributed. And of course, if your prey is in a different place, you've got to move to that different place. And so we're seeing a lot of changes with where we're seeing animals show up. We're seeing also changes in the timings of migration. So for some of the whales like gray whales and for humpback whales, we're seeing some change in the timings that they're making these migrations. And we're also seeing a lot of skinny animals as well. So there's probably a learning curve associated with figuring out where prey even is. Because if you remember, these animals are really long-lived creatures, and a lot of where they're going to feed is based on either memory from their own experience or something that was taught to them from their mother or from other members of the community. And so with climate change, you're throwing in a whole other variable where you're seeing distributions of prey changing drastically. And so that means that these animals are having to find new prey or in some cases switch to a different prey source that's more abundant. So climate change is affecting them on a whole multitude of levels in terms of where they're being sighted.
Yeah, in addition to warming sea surface temperatures, the other big part of climate change in the oceans is ocean acidification. A lot of the basis of the food chain that whales and dolphins depend on is plankton or small schooling fish. And a lot of the zooplankton that build their physical body shells from calcium carbonate are interfered with by increased acidity of the ocean chemistry. And so if that impacts the prey species, then whales and dolphins, they either have a chance to maybe adapt quickly as an individual to that changing if they can start eating something else, or those individuals are not going to be able to survive because those changes are happening so rapidly and so quickly. So yeah, climate change in the oceans is a huge thing, and it already is impacting things substantially.
Mm-hmm. What about, building on that for just a moment, what about noise from engines in the water? Does that affect the communication between the whales? Do you think this could have anything to do with why they are found beached?
So in some cases with the beaching, yes. So there's some evidence where, especially involved with Navy testing, so Navy doing these large sonic tests where they emit these really loud sounds into the ocean, you do find often marine mammal strandings after something like that has happened. But you also see sound just as a general level. We call it sound pollution. So just if you think about all the tankers, all of the cruise ships, all of the recreational vessels that are out on the water at any given time, that's putting a whole lot of noise into the water. And if you remember, marine mammals they live in an acoustic world. They're relying on sound not only to communicate, but also, at least for the toothed whales, to be able to find food with their echolocation. And so one thing that we're seeing in areas that are really high sound levels is that a lot of animals are making much more simple calls. So the complication of their call types is going down, but also changing the frequency that they're vocalizing at to try to get outside of where the boats are kind of white noising it out.
Yeah, think about like shouting. They're essentially shouting over the noise of an engine, or that noise is going to just completely mask the vocalizations that these animals are making. So yeah, this has become a big topic in terms of ocean conservation, not just for whales and dolphins, but other ocean life as well, and that we have to think about where our oceans are noisy, how much noise we put into them, and trying to reduce the amount of noise in certain places that are really important for particular groups of animals or species in certain areas. So yeah, noise pollution is a huge, huge thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have a gray whale question for you. We have a question here. It says, do gray whales sing? And if they do they create new songs every year?
So gray whales, which we with Natural Habitat, we do trips in Baja. I just got back, Rachel and I both got back from Mexico just a couple of weeks ago, actually. And gray whales are fascinating animals. They're migrating up from the Arctic all the way down to the coast of Baja, where they use these lagoons to give birth to their calves. And as far as we've been able to tell, the gray whale does not sing. They have a whole lot of other calls, and they're really cool sounding. They sound a lot like digestive noises, or they have these kind of bong sounds that they make that sounds like a gong, essentially. But they don't have song per se. But the humpback whale, however, they sing, and they have these very, very long, complicated songs that are also very cultural. So if you're in an area during the breeding season, so Hawaii, for instance, or off of Australia, the males in those populations will have these songs. And at any given point in time, all the males in one area are singing the same song. So that song is always evolving, always changing. But those animals are all kind of learning those changes and adopting them as well. So song itself is a really fascinating topic. And so humpback whales are the really poster children when it comes to singing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question, a migration question here. Are there differences in associations and family ties among migrating whales versus non-migrating whales, or do all whales migrate to some degree?
So in terms of how we normally think about migration as really classified by humpback whales in terms of a distinct summer feeding ground and a very distinct winter breeding ground. Generally, the winter breeding grounds are close to the equator, and the feeding grounds are at high latitudes where there's a much higher concentration and abundance of food, which makes it worth going all that way. So humpback whales have this very distinctive migration, as do gray whales, but many other species don't have that clear-cut migration. A lot of toothed whales are going to use different habitats at different times of year. And so you kind of have to stretch your idea of exactly what a migration is. But not all whales are going to the equator in the winter and then the high latitudes in the summer. But certainly there is a seasonal relationship in terms of the habitats that whales use around the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. How old are the oldest whales? How long do they live?
Cool. Yeah, so this is a really awesome one, actually, because if you think about the baleen whales in particular, for a long time we didn't really know how to age them. If you think about, for mammals at least, when you talk about figuring out their age, you usually look at their teeth. Baleen whales don't have teeth, and so you've got to figure out new ways to do that. And one thing that happens is up in the high Arctic, there are native hunts for the bowhead whale. And one of these animals that they captured during a native hunt, inside their blubber, they found an old spear tip. And they actually carbon dated that spear tip to be over 250 years old, which is mind-blowing. And then now we've come up with there's a new technique out there called rasmerization. It's basically looking at the eyeball, the proteins in the eye, and seeing their rate of degradation. And from that, they've also confirmed that, yeah, these animals can live to be over 200 years old. So the bowhead whale, as far as we know, is the longest living mammal out there on the planet.
But again, those are techniques that require the animal to have died. And so in terms of tracking the lives of living animals and seeing what are the extremes that maybe they could live up to, we've only really started paying attention to individual whales since about the 70s. But there are still a significant number of animals that were alive as adults, or maybe perhaps young adults in the 1970s, that are still around today. Particularly killer whales, for example. Female killer whales are definitely living into their 70s and 80s, perhaps longer. But really these long-term studies that really only started in the late 70s will be what tells us how many individuals live beyond 30, 40, 50 years old. But they're definitely long-lived marine mammals, and the bowhead whale, as far as we know now, takes the cake. It's pretty impressive.
That's amazing. Okay, so we know now about oldest whales. What about fastest whale or dolphin? Who gets that honor?
Ooh, the fastest is the Dall's porpoise at 35 miles an hour. They're found in Alaska. They're really cute. They look like these big, muscly Oreos, and they can just zip right along. They're really super muscly Oreos. I love that. That's what I'm going to call them from now on. Yeah.
I love that. So let's talk about the emotions of whales for a moment. Is there evidence of whales mourning the death of a family pod member like in elephant populations?
Yes. Do you know the story better than I do about the killer whale on the Pacific Northwest?
Well, you may have seen headlines, I think it was 2 summers ago. There was a female killer whale, a member of the fish-eating killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, that carried around her dead newborn for 16 days. And this behavior has been documented before and in different populations of killer whales and other toothed whales around the world as well, in terms of stillborn calves that are carried with the mother. So that's one thing that sheds some light on the emotional capacity of these animals. But another part, in terms of looking at emotion, are their brains.
Yeah. So when you look at particularly an orca brain, but also dolphin brains as well, they have a huge portion of their brain is cortex. And so when you think about the cortex, that's kind of the higher thinking part of the brain, and they have a really well-developed limbic system. And for us, at least, that's what controls emotion. And they actually have a whole other part of their brain that we do not have that's closely associated with the limbic system. And so what scientists that are doing neural research on these animals think is that this is involved with emotion somehow. So these animals are probably living these incredibly intense emotional lives, but it's really hard as another species to be able to deduce that, because you can't really ask them how they're feeling today. But from evidence of looking at their brain and just seeing how they behave with each other, another instance of that is these mass strandings that sometimes happen, where it seems that you might have one animal in a group of pilot whales, for instance, that is sick and not doing very well and strands. And what is fascinating, though, is that the rest of the animals that are part of that animal's group strand with it. And so you end up having a lot of animals die around one sick animal. And what you will often find is they are concentrated around that particular animal that is sick. But for whatever reason, they all will go ashore and end up dying together. And so again, a lot of it's speculation, and a lot of it's things that we don't have a ton of knowledge of, just because it's a really hard thing to study. It's very conceptual more than anything else. But it definitely is important to be thinking about, especially with how we value these animals.
Yeah, and indicates that their capacity for emotion might even be greater than our own as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for instance, an orca brain, they're about 80% of their brain is cortex. For humans, 68% of our brain is cortex. So that kind of gives just a little window into potentially there's a lot going on in the minds of these creatures.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, let's see. Last question here. We will take the rest and read them after the webinar and do our best to get some answers to those of you who've not heard your question on the air today. So our last question for today, we hear that there are a lot of plastics in the oceans. How is this affecting whales and dolphins?
So one of the things with whales and dolphins, particularly more the predatory ones, is that, or like the toothed whales, for instance, so again, orcas are another really good example of this, is the concept of bioaccumulation. And so if you're familiar with the issue with DDT and it harming a lot of raptors, birds, a similar idea where you have toxins accumulate through the food chain. And so these animals, particularly like transient orcas, for instance, have really high toxin loads in their system because of a lot of the stuff that's being put into the ocean. So not only plastics and microplastics, but also different kinds of chemicals that run off from cities. You also find animals such as sperm whales that have ended up ingesting a lot of plastics as well, because again, they're using echolocation to find food, but they can mistake, a chunk of plastic bags or plastic bottles for food, and they end up ingesting that. And they've had animals strand and die as a result. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So control
a lot to think about.
What is allowed in the environment, including plastics, is really important. And I think that's definitely people are more aware of that being an issue. Just walking on your own beach, if you're fortunate enough to live near the ocean, you'll see plastics and microplastics everywhere. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So if you happen to live near a beach, join your local beach cleanup whenever you're allowed back outside again, I guess.
That's a great idea. That's really great idea. Well, this has been fun. Thank you so much. We loved seeing you. First of all, I never turned off your webcam, so I loved that we got to see you the whole time. It worked out perfectly.
Really?
It was great. Okay. It was great. I was watching you like a hawk. I was making sure. It was all good. So I want to turn it back over to both of you for some final thoughts before we say goodbye.
All right.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure to be able to chat with all of you, even though we didn't get to see all of your faces. This series that Natural Habitat is doing is just opening up the door to possibilities, and we really encourage this to be an ongoing conversation about conservation and the amazing things that exist as part of our planet, things that you may have seen and things that now you're able to learn about and then go find out in the world for yourself.
Yeah. So hopefully someday when you're out there on a whale watching boat or just sitting on the beach and you see a blob or a fin kind of passing by, just kind of thinking a little bit more about who it is you're looking at, not just what you're looking at. So again, thank you guys so much for
tuning in. Thanks to the wonders of technology and the internet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Connecting us all.
So much fun.
Cool.
And you had a fan club out here today too, just so you know. I think you had some friends and family. Someone who refers to Auntie Paula. Thank you, Auntie Lindsey.
Oh, hi, Kimber.
And some other friends and people who love you very much who are tuning in today as well. And I think we're all now fans of both of you. So thanks again for being with us. Everybody, we have another webinar coming up on Monday. We've got one every day next week. We're going to, so exciting. We're going to start off talking about gray wolves on Monday, and then we've got Brad with us on Wednesday. He's going to talk to us about creating a backyard habitat. And we've got a gray whale talk next Thursday. Will we be with one of you for that?
No,
but Annie.
Yeah, you get to with Annie and Sophie, who are awesome, and we'll be listening.
Annie's going to do that. Okay. And then a week from Friday, we're going to talk about how to use your smartphone to become an expert wildlife photographer. So lots to sign up for. If you haven't done it, check out our email that we sent out and go back and pick the ones that sound good. And with that, we'll wish you all a great weekend and conclude the webinar. Goodbye now.
Bye.